Welcome to yet another episode of Shortcast over Coffee. Today, my guest is Dr. Shruti Rajagopalan. She is a senior research fellow at the Mercatus Center at George Mason University, where she leads the Indian Political Economy Program and Emergent Ventures India. In this episode, I talk to Shruti about the initiatives she works on at Mercatus, economic research in India and the US, and we dive deep into the good and the bad aspects of the goods and services tax in India, also known as GST. So let's dive right into it. Hi, Shruti, welcome to the podcast.
Hi, Bala. It's so great to be here. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, Shruti, let's start with your background. You went to college in Delhi, moved to the US, and you now work for the George Mason University. What do you do? What does your department do? Tell me more about that.
Okay, so I grew up in New Delhi, as you said. I went to University of Delhi. I first got an undergraduate degree in economics. Then I got a law degree, thinking, always thinking I'm going to be a lawyer. And about 6 months into law school, I realized that it's not something that interests me at all. So I found legal problems, legal questions very interesting, but I didn't find anything to do with the practice of law interesting. But good girls from good families don't quit. So you finish what you started. And meanwhile, I was sort of like hopeful that, okay, maybe I didn't like this course or, I don't like this internship. I'm sure something will come around which I really love. So that was sort of the point of view. And I kept going. And I realized I like legal research a lot. I wasn't that much into procedure or going to court, the contract stuff at big law firms, none of that interested me at all. So that's, part one. The second is I still thought like an economist. I didn't think like a lawyer. And once you start thinking like an economist, it's very difficult to flip the switch and stop thinking like an economist. So I audited a law and economics class that was being taught at Delhi School of Economics, which is literally across the street. Delhi University, everything is sort of next to each other. So I went and I audited that class, and it turned out to be eye-opening. I realized there's an entire field within economics called law and economics, and though at that time I think there were like one or two people doing that in India. I'm talking about 15, 20 years ago. Uh, in the United States, there were lots of departments. In fact, all the law schools, the major law schools had a law and economics center and stuff like that. So that was sort of the impetus to look into leaving India to go get advanced degrees in law and economics. So I started with a master's in law and economics. This was one of those European Erasmus consortium programs. So, there's no single university that is large enough or no department large enough to have like a year long or a 2 year course. So, what they do is seven, eight universities get together, they form a consortium, and you sort of rotate different
Erasmus Mundus,
trimesters.
right?
Exactly. So, you do different trimesters in different universities. So, I did my first semester, I think, trimester in Hamburg. Then I went to Ghent in Belgium and in Bologna in Italy. And so that was sort of my master's degree. And after that, I came back. After I didn't go back to India after that. I went to the United States and I started my PhD in economics. Because by then it was crystal clear to me that I'm really an economist and that's what I need to do. So that's what I did. Did what economists do. I studied economics for many years. Then, I mean, there's a American academic track, right? You finish your PhD, you apply for a whole bunch of jobs, you get a job, you get on tenure track, you get tenure. So I did, all the usual things that one does. And after that, I came back to George Mason because there is within George Mason a research think tank called the Mercatus Center, which specializes in economic policy research and student programs. And I had been affiliated with them as a PhD student. They had given me a big, fellowship and paid for my summer research and things like that while I was doing my PhD. So it's been a very long relationship. So I sort of knew everyone there. And they wanted to start working on Indian political economy. So they asked me to come back and they said, will you kick this off for us? And I said, I mean, what could be better than that? That's sort of the dream job. So I used to teach at State University of New York at Purchase College. I quit, which is very strange after getting tenure. But I quit and I moved back to Virginia, where I had done my graduate work, and to George Mason, which is sort of my intellectual home, and can't complain.
Awesome. Anything specific regarding Emergent Ventures that?
Oh, yeah. So that's an interesting grants program that we run. I didn't start this. This was started by Tyler Cowen, who runs Emergent Ventures sort of globally. And his idea was that philanthropy is extremely slow and bureaucratic, right? And because it's slow and bureaucratic, it's also becoming risk averse, because bureaucrats, when they run things bureaucratically, tend to be risk averse. So what happens is, as a consequence, people who are good at writing grant applications end up succeeding more than people who have great ideas. And if there's a Venn diagram between people who have great ideas and people who have, great grant writing skills, depending on which area of academia or science you're in, that overlap can be quite narrow sometimes. So that was one part of it. And the second part of it was, because the grant writing process is so long and requires so much diligence and stuff like that, it ends up being very costly, which means only high dollar amount ideas even get pitched. Because, if you just want a couple of $1,000s, it makes no sense to waste so many months putting together a grant application and submitting it and things like that. So what happens as a consequence of that is some very easy ideas, which would take just a few $100s or a few $1,000s to do some trial and error and see, hey, I have this crazy hunch, does it work? Those never get tried. So what ends up happening is things that we know already, that we know for sure these things work, is what ends up getting pitched, and on a bigger scale and a bigger scale. So uh, to fix that, he started Emergent Ventures. The idea is that it supports moonshot ideas and interesting talent that has potential to eventually work on moonshot ideas. So that's part of it. And the second is that there is a single layer of yes or no. So when an application goes to Emergent Ventures from, say, Ireland or Nigeria, Tyler is the only person who will look at that application, and it's a single layer yes or no filter, right? And that's it. And usually, I mean, he'll look at the application, he'll probably schedule a call with the person who's applied, and then decide what he wants to. But that's the end of it. And we try to look at every application within 72 hours of it hitting our system. And we try to respond within, like, sort of under a week. The longest time period actually is scheduling the call, because of time difference all over the world, especially for me in India. It takes a long time to schedule these calls. And then we wire the money in about 3 days. It takes a few weeks to reach some countries like India, which have complicated banking systems and capital flows issues and stuff like that. Within the United States, if someone applied for a grant and it got approved, within 72 hours, the money will hit their account once it's approved. So it's the idea is, we need experimentation, we need innovation. People who are talented and who are working on really big ideas should not be stuck in this disaster, which is the philanthropic grants system. So that was sort of like the big idea. And Tyler saw some fantastic applications coming from India. And I was not part of Emergent Ventures at all. And he said, hey, we're getting great applications from India. Why don't you look at some of them? And then that's how I started getting involved, sort of like giving my thoughts on some application that was very specific to India, or doing a call with someone from India when he was busy or he was traveling. And eventually it just became like its own thing. I don't know how these things happen, but eventually EV India became its own thing. And I think now we have over 140 winners. Most of them are in India, and some of them are no longer in India, but they're working, all the projects were working on something that applied to India. And it's incredibly young group of very dynamic, very talented people. I mean, this won't surprise you. India is very young, and India does have a lot of hidden talent. And this talent, I think, in India is so incredible and kind of caught Tyler's eye, because if they had been in the American system, for instance, these same people, they wouldn't remain undiscovered, right? They would be in a high school magnet program or a gifted program. They would be in high school accelerators and incubators, or, every college and engineering department. You went to Virginia Tech, right? So, I mean, they will have their own incubators and acceleration programs. That scouting and incubation infrastructure in India is pretty broken. which means that you have $100 bills just lying on the street waiting to get picked up, right? So it's a huge opportunity for people who are willing to invest in looking at interesting talent. It's a great opportunity to scout in India. Of course, it's costly in the sense that you have to really get to know India. You have to get to know the talent. I have a natural advantage. I grew up there, and most of my research is on India. So I end up looking at a lot of different specific sort of sectors of India, even if I'm not actually running a company there or working for an HR consulting firm or something like that. So there is a slight advantage one has as someone who's studying Indian political economy. But somehow it's been one of the most rewarding things I've done in the last few years, just helping talent get off the ground. They're amazing.
Yeah, very interesting. Actually, one of my guests on the show, Soundarya Balasubramani. I mean, I was
Oh yeah,
coincidentally looking you up, and I was like, she was one of the recipients of the grant.
she's
So
fantastic and has a book out, which I read recently, which is really great. I'm guessing that's why you invited her on the show
yeah,
to talk about
yeah.
the.
I mean, generally about writing and also to speak about just the immigration and
Yeah.
all of that.
No,
Yeah.
and so if I am working on the scouting end of it, think of it as like a broad spectrum. Soundarya is working on the opposite end of it, which is once all this talent has been scouted and incubated and trained, there is some stupid immigration rule which is still keeping that talent from flowing to its highest valued use. You personally experienced some of this. The kinds of rules that we have that prevent talented people from doing what they want to do, it's extraordinary, and the immigration rules are the worst of them. Uh, Within India, you have other kinds of misallocations, right? There's everyone ends up becoming an engineer, even though most of the people who do engineering have nothing, no interest in engineering. But it's the signal of a successful person who means business, right? Like someone who is serious and wants to achieve something in life. That's what you're supposed to do. So you can have misallocation of talent for cultural reasons. You can have it for immigration reasons. But I love Soundarya's project because she's trying to solve the misallocation on a very different sort of margin than what I'm trying to resolve. And she's just so dynamic. I'm so thrilled that we were able to support her.
Yeah, and you were mentioning about the I call it the two-way door, right? Let's say someone has a small business idea, they can sort of do some trial and error for 100, 200, or $2,000, and I think Emergent Ventures is solving a great problem in the sense that they
Yeah.
don't have to wait for months and go through all the paperwork and bureaucracy. One of the things that stems my attention is what is sort of the applicant versus successful ratio?
I think it's about 8% the last time we ran the numbers.
Just a tad higher than Y Combinator.
Yeah, it's definitely sub 10%. That I know. I think EV India is a little bit higher, actually. It's higher than 10% because in the initial period, we got phenomenal applications that nobody would have rejected, right? And it's because we don't do any advertising. So the kind of people who are applying already knew someone who had won or they followed Marginal Revolution. They had a very good sense of what this is. Then, I mean, as time goes by and something gets bigger, you also get a lot of weak applications. But we are not trying to maintain any like minimum exclusivity or rejection rates. It's just 8% because those were the great ideas that we thought were worth supporting. Sometimes we don't support great ideas because they're just too big for our support in the sense that, they're already a well functioning company. They want to raise 500,000 in their next round. We're like, yeah, I think you need to go to a VC for this. This is kind of way beyond what we can do. But there are very few ideas past that 8% that were so great that I just deeply regret not being able to support them. If they're great, we will go out of our way to support them.
And there
It's
is
just,
no
not to
consolation prize.
make,
And there is
no,
no
it's not.
consolation prize.
Yeah, but we're not even thinking of it as a price. We're thinking of ourselves as like an enabling agent, not as a selection mechanism. Right. So this is the fundamental difference, right? A lot of people do grants and prizes and awards to say, oh, we are gonna pick winners and pick losers, and now you can rely on us, instead of some other credential, right? So this person didn't go to Virginia Tech or they didn't go to UPenn, but they won an EV grant, and then that's the signal, right? But that's not what we're trying to do at all. We're just trying to support interesting ideas. Some of these people are, I mean, my favorite grantees are always just really young, 15, 16-year-old kids who are trying to do something really bizarre. And it's not even that, oh, they ask for so little or they need very little money. It's that they're just truly creative, and there's nothing else in India that can actually support that kind of work, right? Another small thing is travel grants, right? I mean, you and I, we've studied at American universities. Uh, it is not easy for someone who didn't have friends or family or good advisors at university telling them where to apply in the US or getting them connected with a broader network to actually get plugged in, right? But one way of getting plugged into a network is just simple travel grant, and travel grants are so cheap. It's ridiculous the bang for the buck you get with a travel grant. But isn't it surprising that virtually no one supports travel grants? They want to know what you're going to do. They want to know how many meetings you're going to have. Are you attending a conference? But the best things happen when a truly entrepreneurial person just wants to go somewhere and meet different networks of people. So I think those are the margins on which we are really trying to either, improve the chances of a very interesting talent achieving what they want, or a moonshot goal by getting them plugged into a bigger network. So I don't think of us as a prize for work done in the past, which will then become a stamp of quality and credibility. We're just not in that business. In fact, I would actively encourage people not to think of us that way.
Yeah. I think your point about networking and just building networks is so correct, because having lived in the US for a few years, I realized that the majority of people who come here as students, especially from India, are from certain pockets, and probably the networking did help them, right? At some point, you see people from Bangalore, Pune,
Yeah.
Mumbai, Delhi, Chennai. Can't really
And
think
all
of
the engineering colleges, right? Because their seniors or alumni have gone to these schools before, and there's a system by which you're supposed to apply.
Yeah, it's such a big differentiator, so to speak. Yeah, I mean, I have not met anyone from the Northeast. Never. I mean, probably a few people from Assam, but not too many. So yeah, it's fascinating how much change networking can bring to your life. So, Shruti, I have had this question a lot while growing up as well, and you see examples of economists like yourself. There are some other professors like Bhramar Mukherjee in Chicago. I think she's based out of Chicago. Even Raghuram Rajan, right? So, economists, historians, law and policy researchers based out of India who are looking uh, to research on India. How much of a difference does it make to live outside of India and looking at India versus doing the same research in India?
So the thing is, at Indian universities, the research infrastructure is not great. Okay. And I'll tell you what I mean by that. It takes a lot of resources to incubate a talent, right? And sometimes it's just you are just throwing that money away without being guaranteed a result. Now, it may pan out, it may not pan out. That money may come back manifold later, right? So, the education model in India, and this is understandable for a country with, the per capita income of India, is we need to teach students, we need to make sure that the professors can teach in the classroom, that they can examine, they can grade, and then push them out for the next round which comes in. And even in our teaching system, what we're really doing is a broader selection. Our entire education system is about selecting great talent for the next step and the next step, right? So in high schools and elementary schools, it's not really about teaching, because our literacy and numeracy rates are terrible even after 6, 7, 8 years of schooling. They're trying to select people to finish the 10th grade, and get that pass certificate. Then it's like a selection into college. Then engineering, that selection game pretty well. Right from there, what is the least cost signal to enter a top firm? You do an MBA after engineering, right? So this is what we're doing. Now, where do professors fit into this? If the job is just mainly selection and a little bit of value add, then you really need people who are good at selection, which is conducting exams, and good at controlling how that exam is conducted, what is being taught in the classroom, right? And evaluating who is doing well and who is not doing well, rather than just seeing how many new interesting ideas can sort of blossom in a university. The latter, which is how many new interesting ideas can blossom in a university, how can we make sure that students are really thinking about innovative ideas in any discipline? How can we make sure they're well trained? That requires more time, more incubation, and it requires, therefore, professors who have been incubated longer, because they're the only people who can pass that along. Now, in the United States, I mean, my PhD took 5 years, which is pretty standard, right? In fact, compared to economics PhDs today, it might even be slightly shorter. 5.5, 6 years is the standard PhD in the US these days. That's a lot of money, right? So you know the graduate fees and what it costs. We're talking about a few $100,000 at this point. And yes, some of it, students like me will make it up by doing research assistantship work for professors, by becoming a teaching fellow. So, we kind of cross-subsidize our own education. But
On
it's
that
still
note,
incredible.
when it comes to STEM degrees, people usually don't pay a dime. But
Yeah.
how is it for economics? Do people pay the fee?
No, no. If you have to pay to do your PhD, you probably shouldn't do it
Shouldn't
in
do it. Yeah.
economics. That's the rule, right? So same in STEM. But my point is someone's paying for it, right? And the model in the United States is undergrads are paying for it, right? So some of it the government pays for because they give research grants to senior professors, and senior professors pass on a portion of that grant to the researchers and the PhD students who are working in the lab or working on the research team. And the rest of it is paid by undergrads. And that means that the fees for undergrads is pretty high because they're literally cross-subsidizing innovation, research, and development, right? And that is the model of elite universities in the United States. That model obviously can't function in India because it's going to be very difficult to charge students. So that model had to be, the government has to pay for education and the government has to build up institutes of research and excellence. And that was sort of, I think, also Nehru's vision, and his idea was that the government will do this. The trouble is the government incentives tend to be broken and they rely hugely on large budgets, right? And for the first, say, 4 to 5 decades, with socialism and very, very stagnant per capita income growth, very, very stagnant revenue growth for the government, there was just simply no constituency where this much money was being demanded and it would give something in return to the bureaucrats or the politicians or anyone. Like, who is demanding this high level of research that is then, so the politicians say we need this research to be an input in whatever we do as our output, sure, it would have gotten done. But, there's no politician who's really saying, the thing I'm really lacking is research and analytics and things like that, right? Bureaucrats were a little bit more friendly because they tend to be elite. They tend to come from good education institutions. They will get a seat on the board, right? They will be the valued alumni. They will get some ribbon cutting opportunities and, things like that. So they're a little bit like yes minister, right? So there's a little bit more of a tendency to support elite research institutions. But again, no one really is going to stick their neck out for this. So now, how are these institutions making money when the culture is not driven based on innovation? So either you need that or you need a culture, even if it's not based on R&D, at least the incentives align. Like India has lots of construction because the politician and construction incentives align very well, right? Every time a tender is floated, politicians will get some money and make a site. That's also not true for R&D. And the third is because industry was completely controlled through industrial licensing, we didn't get much industrial research either. Right? If you notice for semiconductors, so much of the research is actually done in the private sector, industrial R&D as opposed to government R&D. So none of those things really took off in India. So for all these reasons, our institutions never really became champions of research. which means if you want to do economics research, which honestly takes a long time because of the incubation required, you have to leave, right? Now, the trouble is, earlier people used to leave and then they went back to India to teach. Like, Jagdish Bhagwati left, but he went back to teach at the Delhi School of Economics and, so on. But over a period of time, as these institutions started deteriorating, and you tell someone who's a PhD from, MIT that, oh, now you have to teach these 7 courses. Anytime you want to innovate, you have to go back. There's going to be a standard syllabus. You can't set your own curriculum. You can't choose the students in your class. You can't float a graduate seminar. Who's going to want to do it? Right? So the opportunities also started drying up. And frankly, the pay was terrible. So for all these reasons, the really talented people, and this is not about economics, it's in any area, it was just much easier to be away. But research is also driven by passion. So the questions you choose can't be based on convenience, right? So I live in Falls Church, but India's municipal financing is far more interesting to me than Falls Church's municipal financing, where I'm sure there are some kinks and issues, but it largely functions, right? My garbage is getting picked up and the parks are pretty well kept and so on. But the Indian problems are the really interesting problems. So that's the reason that there's a tendency for, the typical foreign educated economist or lawyer or policy researcher to actually think about India and sort of Indian problems. And American universities gave us an opportunity to publish. And if you publish at a high enough level, it didn't matter what country you were focused on. So, American system was kind of incentive compatible. Now, the second part of the question is how hard is it? I think now increasingly it's easier and easier to get data when you're abroad. Like I remember recently we were talking to Rakesh Mohan and he talked about how he had to go to India and, go to all these planning commission offices and sit down with pen and paper to make notes on agricultural productivity yields or, something else that he was looking at for his dissertation. Now that's become much easier. What has become harder is to gain the relevant context. And I think this is where economics is going slightly wrong. I think there are too many bright young economists in the US and political scientists who go to India for one field visit and they're like, okay, now we know what we're doing. And we're going to use the model with some slight tweaks for India. Whereas that may not be the relevant way to think about it. In fact, I have a paper with Alex Tabrock where I talk about, elite imitation. This very elite set of economists, they are imitating the best practices and the literature and what they are reading in the West and trying to import it into India, right? India needs something completely different to increase female labor force participation rate. And it's not a maternity law as tight and strong and good as Norway, right? There are 15 other incentive problems and culture problems and structural adjustment problems, which are broken in India before you get to that maternity point, right? But there will be economists who, with a straight face and without any malintention, supported by what they think is the best of research, will say, we think we need, Denmark, Norway level maternity law in India. And we're like, oh, good God, that's just a bad idea. So I think the second part of it, it's not hard to do, but it's hard to do well.
And your discussion with other economists based, who do research on India but are based in the US, they also kind of resonate the same thing.
I think it varies from economist to economist, not so much on location. You've had Ajay Shah on the podcast. You should ask Ajay this question and then let him loose for the next 1 hour because he will give you 25 examples of how people are engaging in this kind of elite imitation. He always says, look at problems in your own backyard, right? So Ajay very much believes that. But there are many other economists who are not that concerned with the question. They're like, hey, trade model is a trade model is a trade model. So I think it also depends on what they're doing. Are they doing empirical work or theoretical work? Are they actually doing policy recommendations at the end of the, whatever comes out of their research? I think those things differentiate who is in which camp.
Yeah, it's
But there's
actually
far too little criticism overall of
it's
young
actually
Indian economists.
yeah, it's actually super interesting to see two different sides of the story, right? I was having a conversation with Dr. Vidita Vaidya. She's a famous neuroscientist based out of Mumbai, TIFR. Won the Infosys Prize, Shanti Swarup Bhatnagar Award,
Yeah.
and all that. And I was asking her this question, after she did a doctorate in Yale and then went to Karolinska Institute. was it difficult coming back to India? And she said, no, I was happy to be home. I just wanted to go back to Bombay so badly. And then setting up a lab was difficult. She also faced a lot of red tapeism. And she was like, I was just so determined to get it done that
Yeah.
that I did. And
No, and I think kudos for that.
yeah.
I applied to, I think, about 20 jobs in India. I didn't even get an interview call. So I think it is difficult to break in. I think it's difficult once you break in to start projects to like build a lab just feels like a pipe dream. So
That too
I
with the
mean,
machinery,
incredible
right?
that
It
she
was
did that.
biotech. Yeah.
Yeah.
I was so fascinated. But again, if you ask the same question to another scientist, they may be like, yeah, figuring all of this out, I may lose 7 years of my career.
Yeah.
That's probably the most fruitful of my
Yeah.
time. So why do I have to go through that? So yeah, I might have pulled her back with respect to research, but kudos to her. I mean, she's doing great.
Yeah. And TIFR is exceptional. A lot of the other government institutions have even more red tape and barriers than
Yeah.
TIFR, believe it or not. Right. And then there are things like IIT. I always talk to some faculty at IIT and I think, oh my God, this is like one of the most elite universities in India. But it's directly controlled by Ministry of HRD, right? It is so difficult for them to hire because everything requires some central government babu to eventually approve whatever they're doing. I think there was a point in time when they didn't allow OCI hires or something like that. Uh, these are like, people who
Yeah.
are Indian citizens, sorry, American or non-Indian citizens, but persons of Indian origin. So it was just, I mean, can you imagine what a huge nightmare it is if your HR is literally controlled by Union of India, not even by like, some not so great bureaucrat at your own university. So it's incredible that she managed to do that.
Yeah.
Really like lots of respect for it.
Yeah. It was a good conversation. Yeah. I did not know this would be her answer, so I was super curious, and I'm glad I asked that. Shruti, I came across your relatively recent paper on GST, and
Yeah.
it's incredible how much at in depth you go in that paper. And let's start with why GST, why a thing like GST is important for a country like India, especially when it comes under the so-called developing background. And is that a fair enough model for other countries with a similar economy?
So one of the, just to zoom out a bit, even other than GST, one of the biggest difficulties for developing economies is to develop state capacity, right? Now, that's difficult because they're poor, right? So the tax base tends to be pretty low, small, and it's hard to raise revenues, especially off the back of relatively low income groups. And if you can't raise revenue, then you can't build up state capacity to then say, build all the infrastructure you need, build the education institutions, build the fantastic research centers we were just talking about, and staffing them with the fantastic talent from, MIT or Princeton or wherever it is. So this is just a trap, right, for every developing economy. And the developing economies that manage to come out of that trap are the ones that do very well, right? Now, on the base of it, developing economies that come out of this trap is the base is economic growth. As the economy grows faster and more people get richer, you can raise more tax revenue either through consumption taxes, income taxes, wealth taxes, corporate taxes, whatever area of revenue that you're looking at. But revenue generation is incredibly important for a developing country. But there's a second part to it. If you're a relatively poor country where you have relatively weak state capacity, then it is also very hard to enforce your own tax laws, right? Because you need a massive infrastructure and good incentives and excellent workers who are paid really well to enforce those laws. You're obviously not a country or government that's in a position to do that, which means that most people are just going to flout and not pay taxes. Right? Tax evasion is pretty rampant and there's a lot of corruption. So, what ends up happening is all your tax officers make huge rents, and the state actually doesn't get most of what people end up paying, which means your infrastructure remains broken, which means more people now want to evade taxes because they're not getting anything in return for their taxes. So this is kind of the trap that countries are in. Now, to resolve this trap, two things need to happen. One, you need to figure out taxes which are broad-based enough that you're not imposing a very big burden on a very narrow group of people, right? The second part of it is that you need to be able to enforce that. The more broad-based a tax, the harder it's going to be to enforce, because now you need a phenomenal tax administration system that can actually look into every single person and make sure every business, every firm, everyone is paying their taxes. So this is the standard problem, right? So this is why we separate developing countries' tax systems from developed countries' tax systems, right? Finland and Norway may have problems with their tax system, but this is not the problem, right? The problem is not that they don't have the state capacity to enforce. And to build the state capacity, they need revenue. So now, having said that, where does GST come into all this? So the way the Indian tax system proliferated, and this is mainly for indirect taxes, uh, India started out with this point of view that tax burden should be relatively low. We shouldn't tax various parts of the agricultural sector of the economy. And this was really a colonial legacy, right? Where there had been such huge tax burden on that sector that they thought they shouldn't do that. Now, if you don't burden one sector of the economy, that has to come from somewhere else. So what are you going to do? Every state started imposing its own set of indirect taxes, and these were, typically somewhere in your sales law, sales tax, your customs, sort of, those kinds of cesses and taxes, excise, customs, sales tax. This is kind of the typical basket of things. And within this, there is a central government levying tax, and every state is kind of levying its own tax. Now, two, three things happen because of that. One, there is sort of overlapping taxes, and because no one sort of looked at it carefully, and you don't have credit offsets and things like that, uh, there are certain sectors which are just taxed so many layers over and over again that they now find it more productive to evade the tax. The second problem is, in a federal system like India, where you have free movement guaranteed by the constitution, if there is a differential between the customs or the sales tariff or tax between two states, then at the checkpoint, the border checkpoint between states, there has to be something that's collected or something that's offset, right? Which means now what ends up happening is you are fragmenting the country into what could have been one universal free trade zone into fragmented zones, right? And add to this the logistical delays. Now, technically, if you have the state capacity of Finland or Norway, you can have a fantastic checkpoint where everything gets processed in 5 minutes and everything is electronic and you go, 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 right? But you also don't have that. So what would happen is it would take, I don't know, maybe 12 to 13 weeks just to cross from the southern part of the country to the northern part of the country,
Oh yeah, I mean
right?
I'm from Palakkad, and Palakkad is the border
Yeah.
of Kerala and
Yes.
Tamil Nadu, and every time we used to go to Coimbatore, I could see there was like a Walayar check post where there
Yes.
were like lines and lines of
Yeah.
trucks,
Yeah. So
and
it's just
apparently.
like one half of the road is blocked, right? So there's one half of the road where trucks are just standing and all the cars will like kind of go on over the side, and they're just waiting endlessly for days. And now imagine the consequences of that. Produce, hell no. You're only going to have local supply chains, right? So you won't get great, like, banana chips that you get in Kerala. You can't get them, on the eastern side of Tamil Nadu, for instance, though it's actually not that far. So you get where I'm going with this. So what were the other things you observed at that checkpoint?
I mean, just that, and then I mean, these are some of the things that I read in the papers, that lot of corruption, right?
Yes.
That was pretty rampant. Again, I don't have any first-hand reference to speak about, but I'm sure that was going on quite a bit.
Yeah. So you kind of hit the nail on the head, right? So between corruption, the delays, and the uncertainty which gets built in, right? Because once there's delay and corruption, if you can't be sure how long it takes for your goods to reach from point A to point B, unless there is a huge margin, right, that can recover that cost, you're not actually going to ship stuff. So I grew up in New Delhi, and until very recently, I never saw banana chips in New Delhi, to my great disappointment. I'm getting obsessed with this banana chips thing. But the North doesn't have 30 kinds of bananas, right? The South does. And it's a very specific flavor in different parts of Tamil Nadu and Kerala. You will get different kinds of bananas, and also the preparation will be different. And we'd go to the South and we'd get this, and you come back to the North, and there's just, nothing. So you can get Lay's potato chips and Uncle chips, and you go to the farthest corner of the Northeast, and you will get Pepsi, and you will get Uncle chips, right? But it's not true for smaller
On that
banana
note,
chip flavors.
slight digression, but recently Krish Ashok put this wonderful array of bananas that he found in Nagarkoil. It was so cool.
Yeah. So oh my God, Nagarkoil has, oh yeah. Just thinking about it, I can taste like banana chips in my mouth. So, and I started realizing I get better quality banana chips, Indian banana chips in the United States at like the local Patel Brothers or something, than my mother had access to in, pre-GST in New Delhi. And the reason is American Indians are at an income level that merits the extra amount you have to pay in shipping and customs and everything else. Whereas Indians, for 30 rupee packet of banana chips, are not going to pay 200 rupees for it, right? We're a very cost sensitive country. My mother will say we just make it at home, right? So really good South Indian, Tamil families, Malayali families just make the banana chips at home, and you're not going to pay 200 rupees for it outside. So that was what was being lost, right, in this process. So where I'm going with this is, it's not just that I was deprived of banana chips, which is bad enough. There are so many trades that could have happened that were not happening because of this system. So if you make the country a free trade zone and you generally improve the roads and the rails and the air infrastructure, how many more trades, profitable, great trades could happen? How many more people would be really happy paying for things that were made somewhere else by some small business than they are happening right now, right? So that's the big essence of this. So the size of the market, that is the number of trades that are taking place, can just explode, or it can get completely shackled depending on how your taxation system works, across different states. And the third advantage of GST, of course, was just reduce corruption and tax evasion. So the idea is, the three advantages: streamlining, and then converting India into a single free trade zone, reducing tax evasion. These were the intended outcomes. Now, why GST, right? You could just have a centralized sales tax, one single one for the whole country, which can do the job. The nice thing about GST, which is really a value-added tax, right? It's called a
Consumption
goods
tax,
and services tax, but it's a value-added tax, which means relative to other consumption taxes, value-added taxes at each level through the production process, each producer only pays for the amount of value they add in the production process, right? Now, what that does automatically is, if you want to make sure that you only pay for the value added and not for the entire amount, then you need to get your invoices from the suppliers who supplied the goods to you, right? So if you're a small business making banana chips, right, and you only want to pay the tax on the value you added on the banana chip, someone who is selling you the raw banana, you need that invoice, right? Which means they need to have paid the taxes on that. So what happens with a value-added system is, it becomes very, very sort of incentive aligned even before the government comes into the picture. And that obviously means that the amount of administrative costs that the government has to incur dramatically reduces, because it is in everyone's incentive in the pipeline to make sure that they get the invoicing right and they show the amount of tax. The more complex your production process, the less likely it is that you're going to start tampering with. It's very difficult to tell an entire network of people who, a banana chips is simple, right? So you have like 4 inputs. You have bananas, you have salt, you have oil, you have some labor and things like that. But you start getting into bicycles, right? There's hundreds of parts, right? Lots of different people supplying lots of different things. So now it's going to become very difficult to say, okay, you give me a fake parchi or a fake invoice, and then I will also fake it, and then we will all pull a fast one of it up. So that's kind of the idea. And for these reasons, the GST, which is, a VAT system, was being talked about in India, I mean, for decades, yeah, Bala. Like, I
Yeah.
mean, there's expert committee report upon report, which is talking about all these different aspects. And I think, you know, 2010 onwards, it started getting a lot more momentum. And then, the previous UPA government had also floated the idea of the GST.
Yeah.
They obviously could get it done. They had commissioned some committee reports, which were all overwhelmingly in favor of the GST. And then the Modi government, which had, strong enough parliamentary support or enough seats at the union level, and had enough state governments that were BJP, right?
Mm.
Both of these things matter. They managed to stitch together a deal, which eventually passed the constitutional amendment to make sure that the GST comes through. And the idea of the GST, as it says, goods and services tax, it would apply to all goods and services in the economy. That was the original idea, right? It would cover everything. And it was called the good and simple tax, where the idea was, once again, that it would have this incentive alignment feature, but we would keep, maybe just a couple of tax rates, because the previous system, which had the central sales tax, central excise duty, all these other additional duties, something for textile, something for medical, something for sin goods, all of that stuff would now disappear, right? So that was kind of the idea. That's why it's the good and simple tax. Now, that obviously didn't pan out, and we could talk about why that did pan out, but this is sort of the long answer to your short question about the the why does this matter so much for developing countries more than developed countries.
Yeah, I mean, when the GST was implemented, the promise was that GDP is going to go up by 1 to 2%, but that hasn't quite happened. And to your point about, the fake receipts and fake invoices, right? India is, a lot of these, like you said, the example of banana chips, a lot of these industries are unorganized or not coming under a much more complex supply chain and manufacturing system, right? So it's much easier for them to fake an invoice. So as a result, is the loss much greater because India is predominantly unorganized?
So, the two are related, right? Now, according to me, most people don't want to make criminals out of themselves, right? Most people just want to comply with whatever the set of rules are. Nobody wants like random audits, and no one wants to get into the hassle of it. The only time people do it is when something is so costly that it's actually cheaper to flout it than pay it, right? So a sensible tax system has to keep this in mind, because people are, you know, uh, self-interested, utility maximizing individuals wherever we go, right? So either you have a kind of tax enforcement system where it is just so costly to flout it, even for a pack of gum, that nobody is going to do it, which India doesn't have the state capacity to do. Or given that you don't have the state capacity to do it, and there are lots of incentives built in for doing all these fake receipts, you just figure out a system that's simple. So what I find is in India with GST, sometimes, not sometimes, often, especially for small businesses, not for big businesses, the compliance mechanism is just so messy and so complex that it's just easier to say we're not going to do this, right? So I'll give you my favorite example. So every time I go to India, when I don't go for work, it's typically like a family wedding or someone's milestone birthday or something like that, right? Which means I immediately got to show up, and the first thing my mother will tell me to do is get my clothes sorted out. Which the first trip is to the tailor, right? What blouse needs to get stitched for what sari or something like that. And this is like a small boutique, literally in my parents' apartment building, like, another apartment, someone is running like a little boutique out of one room. She has two registers, one with tax paying customers and one with non tax paying customers, right? And again, it's a simple enough thing, right? Her number of inputs required are relatively few, right? So she has only, she's probably going to one fabric, shop somewhere, which is selling her all the fabric, someone just selling her all the buttons and things like that. So the number of things, inputs required are pretty few. So she's able to get away with this, right? But we basically turned like a really nice Indian auntie running a small business out of her home into a criminal. And if you ask her why she's doing this, right? She says, oh, earlier all of it used to be off the books. Then I started making too much money. Now there's more and more stuff on the books. But I still do some stuff off the books because my suppliers are too small to actually comply with GST. So I need to still keep a register that's off the books versus on, right? So this has become a problem. So if either you are not big enough or your input suppliers are not big enough, you are now forced into engaging in some level of tax evasion or some level of, so either you just eat the losses and say, you know what, even if my supplier didn't pay the tax on this, I'll just pay the whole thing, forget about the input credit, right? I don't need it. Or you're going to end up turning into a criminal, right? So this is what we've basically done. That's the simple answer to your question.
Yeah, fascinating. Again, coming back to the GDP thing, we were supposed to hit 1 to 2% increase each year. Did not hit the target. What went wrong was, I mean, people complain about the implementation all the time. But if you were to zero in on, like, let's say the top three things that went wrong, was it the, surgical strike kind of implementation without much of a thought, or
So I think it's multiple things. More generally, there was an economic slowdown, and then COVID, of course, just really hurt. So there was a secular slowdown in India in terms of growth rates happening since 2011, right? So let's keep that in mind, because taxes are a percentage or a fraction of what is actually being bought and sold in the economy. So if that is slowing down, then your revenue growth from taxes will also slow down. So this is something to keep in mind. Now, how much is GST making that worse is the real question, right? Not COVID, not the secular slowdown. And GST could have hastened it also if it was sensible. So that's, something to keep at the back of your mind. Now, when it comes specifically to GST right off the bat got messed up, because what was supposed to be a good and simple tax turned into multiple tax rates, right? Most countries in the world will have one non-zero rate and at most two non-zero rates. There are like a handful of countries, and these are all terrible economies, where India is very oddly in that bizarre company. It's not in the company of good economies, company of terrible economies that have more than four rates, right? So India started with more than three non-zero rates right at the beginning. And the logic was, look, this is a really poor country. The people who are driving a BMW and the person who's riding a bicycle, we can't possibly charge them the same GST rate. And that's the problem, right? Which means immediately you have rate proliferation. And if you have rate proliferation in what was supposed to be a really straightforward tax at the implementation level, you've now introduced so much complexity that it costs small businesses just very high amounts of money to comply with the new system, right? There are a couple of other issues, such as if there's rate proliferation, now everyone wants to be in the low rate, which means you've unleashed a massive rent-seeking and lobbying economy. Now everyone's rate can't be low. Some people's rates need to be high. So now there's a political economy question of what kind of businesses and sectors end up getting put in the low rate, what kind of businesses end up in the high rate, and so on. But the first problem is still the proliferation of rates.
Yeah, on that note, there was a small business based out of Indore which was making detergents, and they were about to sell it on Amazon. I think detergents or dishwashers, I can't quite remember. But they accidentally picked luxury goods, and they were taxed at a much higher price that they barely broke even, by the end of it. So, yeah.
Yeah, so that is one kind of a problem. That is, someone picked the wrong tax rate. But think about something more basic, right? So let's start with, if you're worried about a regressive tax system, a consumption tax is not the best place to worry about it, because by definition, a consumption tax is regressive, right? So for those who are not familiar with, sort of this kind of public finance terminology, the idea of what is a regressive tax is, in absolute terms, whatever is the rupee amount or the dollar amount that's paid, if a rich person and a poor person are paying the identical rupee amount, that means that as a percentage of income, the poor person is paying a higher amount in taxes compared to a rich person, right? So let me give you a concrete example. So, Parle G biscuits, right? Now, Parle G biscuits are literally like the poor man's food, right? You get a 5 rupee packet. It's sold at all these traffic lights, construction workers who didn't make their wages that day are eating Parle-G biscuits and drinking, some
Cutting
water
chai.
and going to bed. Exactly. That's kind of like, really the poor man's, the do sukhi roti in urban areas is Parle-G biscuits. Parle-G biscuit, the smallest packet is 5 rupees. Okay. It has an 18% GST. Okay. Now, who are the kinds of people eating Parle-G? Now, construction worker is one kind of person, right? Another kind of person is a senior citizen, right? A third kind of person is a kid. It's an easy thing to put as a lunch snack or something, in a kid's lunchbox, right? So hang in with me for this example. So let's say that there is a construction worker, right? Construction workers are earning about 100 rupees a day, right? That's the rough amount. And let's say there's a chartered accountant, who's earning a lot, right? Now, how much do chartered accountants earn? They earn like some 40, 50 lakhs a year. So a chartered accountant is earning 10,000 rupees a day, roughly speaking, right? Compared to the 100 rupees a day that a construction worker is earning. So the chartered accountant is putting that, that Parle-G biscuit in their child's tiffin box. Both of them are paying 18 rupees, 18% on a 5 rupee Parle-G. And that's about 1 rupee, just, under 1 rupee. It's a fifth. So someone who's making 100 rupees a day is paying 1% in tax on Parle-G. And someone who's making 10,000 rupees a day is also paying 1 rupee tax. And both of them are paying exactly 1 rupee. So in absolute terms, it's not regressive, right? Both of them pay the same amount. But as a fraction of their income, the poor person ends up paying far more tax. Now, carry this example further down. Poor people pay a larger fraction of their income in consumption than in savings or wealth accumulation or anything else, right? So if you're relying a lot on consumption taxes as your main source of revenue, then your tax system is automatically regressive. Now, if you rely on property taxes, which is, wealth accumulation, we know richer people have larger property, higher valued property, they have it in better neighborhoods and so on and so forth. Same thing for income, right? So if you sort of tax those parts of the economy, then automatically that it's going to be progressive, right? If you rely on consumption taxes, off the bat, it is regressive. So the idea was, let's not make it more aggressive, right? Let's make sure that the guy who buys the BMW pays 28%, and the guy who buys the bicycle, I think when they originally introduced it, was 12%. A bicycle without a motor, right? That's how these things are defined, right? So bicycle without a motor is 12%. A moped is 28%. But a BMW is also 28%, right? So now imagine who is buying a moped, who's buying a Hero motorcycle, and who's buying a BMW. Compare the BMW guy, the moped owner is a poorer person. So if you start getting into this, you're going to get a lot of rate proliferation, and you're going to get a lot of administrative time devoted to what is a rich man's good versus what is a poor man's good. And that's not so clear, right? My favorite example of this is chocolates are taxed higher than Indian sweets, like burfis, right? So now the question is, how do you tax a chocolate burfi? Is it a chocolate?
A classic example is Kit Kat. Is it a biscuit or a
Exactly.
chocolate? Yeah.
Yeah, that's an existential question, right? Are you a biscuit? Are you a chocolate? Now you are whatever is the lower rate on GST. So that's how it ended up. So this rate proliferation happened because they thought they were offsetting the regressive nature of what is an inherently regressive consumption tax. But the more rate proliferation you have, the more rent seeking you're going to get. And the second part of it is smaller firms are not going to be able to lobby the government quite as well, right? Sectors which have very high competition, lots of small firms can never lobby the government as effectively as oligopolistic and monopolistic sectors. So that's one problem. The other problem is small firms, right, are going to find it very difficult to now start figuring out which of their inputs have to pay 28%, 12%. I mean, everyone has to turn into a chartered accountant now. And if you've gone even to a small store, in Palakkad, I visited Palakkad, you have even a roadside shop, right? You will have at least 40 different items being sold. You'll have all your cigarette, gutka, cold drinks, those types of things. You'll have a couple of things for, kids who are like traveling. You'll have a couple of essential things which travelers need. Minimum 30, 40 things. Now, if they were all taxed at the same rate, imagine how easy it is for that guy on the roadside stall to actually pay his taxes. And imagine now how difficult it is for someone who's going to be making few hundred rupees a day to hire a chartered accountant, right? Who's going to do his taxes for him. So what's the easier thing to do? Either eat your losses or just not pay the tax. And if enough people are getting bogged down by this, then enough people will not pay the tax.
Yeah, hire a chartered accountant who also gives his kid the same parleji taxed at 12%. And yeah, that's actually fascinating. Coming to the tax system in the US, right? I live in California, where there is a heavy sales tax. You mentioned about consumption tax being regressive. Texas has no sales tax, but it has a heavy property tax. So, should we call Texas less regressive than California?
Sorry, I was just texting you. You froze for a second. Can you just repeat that again, Bala?
Yeah. Uh, oh, thanks. So I live in California, and California has a higher percentage sales tax. And you were mentioning how consumption taxes are regressive, right? Texas has no income tax, or let's say Portland, Oregon has no
State income
sales.
tax, yes.
Yeah, state income tax, and Portland, Oregon has no state sales tax
Yeah.
or sales tax. So is Oregon more progressive than California when it comes to taxation?
It depends. So Texas, for instance, does tax property values.
Yeah.
So that tends to be an extremely progressive tax. I don't know the rest of Oregon's tax system, but if they are taxing property and they are taxing sort of income, that typically, all things held equal, they tend to be more progressive than regressive. If you're taxing, consumption at a high level, then that typically tends to be more regressive, right? That's the general. But now again, it depends on what kinds of rules you have, what kind of zoning laws you have, how are property values determined. So I don't want to get into that too much. But Texas, I think, largely has a pretty solid property tax system and raises a lot of its revenue through that base.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it has a high property tax. Um, so it's safe to say that the implementation of GST was messed up, and it hurt smaller firms much more than the bigger firms.
Yeah. So in that sense, it tends to be regressive, right? So now if we were talking about that Parle G example where a construction worker who has 100 rupees, income is paying 1 rupee on it versus the guy who makes 10,000 rupees a day is also paying 1 rupee. Now imagine that from the point of view of a business, not an individual, right? So businesses, based on the amount of revenue they're earning, how much do they have to dedicate to GST compliance, right? So if you're a showroom selling BMWs in Mumbai, right, you're obviously like working at the highest end of this. You're turning over a lot of cars, so you're making, steady stream of revenue. You're really under the government's sort of glare, so you can't exactly evade taxes. And it makes sense for you to hire a chartered accountant and incorporate that as part of the cost of running the business, right? And there aren't too many showrooms that sell BMWs, which means there's also, if someone wants to buy a BMW, there are only a couple of places they can go, right? Now, imagine the street seller in Palakkad, right? Now, he's facing multiple problems. So, first is his turnover is not huge the way it is for a BMW seller. His markups are not huge. If he starts selling a higher markup because, he wants to comply with the taxes, people will be like, you're crazy. Why should I pay the higher markup? They'll just go a couple of miles further down and they'll buy their bottle of water from the next Kirana shop, right? So he either needs to pay a chartered accountant, which is not cheaper than 8,000 rupees. So he's now spending 10,000 rupees of his overall revenue to someone, or he should simplify and only sell 2 or 3 goods. Like the lady who stitches my blouse, she has only 2, 3 inputs. So it's easier to fake or, not bother about invoices. Or, just say, I'm going to eat the losses. I'm going to evade the tax, and I'll see if I don't eat the losses, I evade the tax, and the government scrutiny will just land on me like a ton of bricks. So you're taking all these chances, and that's basically the problem. The smaller you are, the harder it is for you, and the smaller you are, typically, the more you need to be competitive because there are lots of other people competing with you. There are very few small shops which are producing phenomenal monopoly goods where there is a huge markup, right?
Yeah,
Maybe
yeah.
an artist or a painter or someone who's like an amazing designer of clothing. They have a tiny boutique and they are so gifted and so different that they can have a huge mark. pretty much no one else who runs a small firm can afford to do that. So I think that's the problem. They're selling goods which are highly elastic, which means they're highly responsive to price, which means this compliance cost imposes a very big burden on them.
Yeah, so I mean, thinking about solutions, again, one other thing that surprises me is alcohol is not taxed, right? I mean, it doesn't have,
Yes.
yeah.
So there were a few things which were left outside the purview of GST. Stamp duty and property transactions was one of them, right? So there were a few such things which were left outside the purview of GST. Alcohol was one of them. And one thing they managed to bring in, which was considered a huge win, was tobacco, right? Which used to be outside the purview. So they thought they can do this in a piecemeal way. Let's just get the compromise we can get. Then eventually we'll include alcohol. Eventually we'll include property and so on. So you're absolutely right. There are a bunch of things which are left out because there are different states which want to keep that portion completely for themselves because, GST, as you know, is a revenue sharing arrangement.
For
That
example,
central GST.
Kerala.
Yeah. And there are also states that have prohibition,
Yeah.
right? Which makes this a little bit more complex. So if you have a central system and no checkpoints and you include alcohol, then now how do we deal with that, right? Uh, Even on things like tobacco, actually, you've hit upon something quite interesting. So alcohol is, interesting for reasons such as there are states which have prohibition. Tobacco is interesting for a completely different reason. Many people try and use a tax instrument for more than just revenue generation, right? Because the idea is if you impose a tax on something, then it's obviously going to raise the price. If it's a relatively inelastic good, then the government can make a killing on that because inelastic goods means the huge markup of the tax goes entirely towards revenue. And if it's a sin good, where we are truly trying to discourage people from doing whatever sin they are engaging in, then the idea is that they will reduce their consumption of that particular good, right? So now what's a typical sin good? Alcohol would have counted, but alcohol is excluded. So let's talk about tobacco, right? Now, remember now we've had proliferation of goals, not just rates, right? Originally, our goal was that we need to make sure poor people, right, can have lower rates for goods that are used by poor people. Now, with sin goods, you are like, a second goal is, on sin goods, the government can make a lot of money because it's relatively inelastic, right? And now there's a third thing, which is health issues. We want to tax certain goods like cigarettes more so that, people are more healthy. So now you have three different goals and everything is not going to go in the same direction, right? So think about what are the different forms in which we consume tobacco, right? So you have cigarettes and you have BDs. Now, of course, this is a matter of taste and preference, but we know that typically poorer people use BDs and richer people smoke cigarettes, especially branded cigarettes, right? Now, cigarettes and BDs are both taxed at 28% because they are supposed to be sin goods and we're supposed to discourage them. But there is an additional cess on cigarettes because it's the rich man's sin good of 10%. In some states, it's more or less. Whereas on BDs, there isn't. So now there are a group of people who said you should impose this on BDs also because the poor people need to reduce their tobacco consumption even more than rich people because they don't have access to good health care. And you've seen Gutka Mukesh and all the scary ads that come before, all your cigarette smoking disclaimers and stuff like that, right? So now BD smokers are at higher risk. You should have imposed a higher cess on them. But our original reason for having low rates for BDs versus cigarettes was because poorer people smoke BDs and it's regressive. So now what are we trying to achieve? Are we trying to achieve a health goal? Are we trying to achieve a sin goal where you can make a killing of the inelastic sales of a good? Or are you trying to achieve a progressive tax system within a consumption tax system? So once you start getting into this, it's just chaos. And this is why a single rate is always the cleanest, right? It may seem regressive, but actually it ends up being more progressive once you account for administrative costs, once you account for rent seeking and lobbying, once you account for compliance cost, where for small businesses it's always harder than for big businesses and so on. Who is selling BDs? Cigarettes are literally being sold in singles. I don't even know what's going on with cigarette invoicing in India, right? So you go to any cigarette shop in India, they'll sell you a single cigarette. How are they invoicing this at 28% plus cess? So clearly, ITC or whichever tobacco company is selling them a bunch of, cigarettes. They're either pricing in the amount of tax they have to pay because it's already been invoiced onto the single cigarette buyer, which is always more expensive than buying a pack, or again, they're eating the law. So I don't know what's going on in this political economy. And it is a tough, low margins business. I've never seen a pan wala or a cigarette selling guy like sort of, live in the lap of luxury. So this whole thing is somewhere really like it just doesn't make sense anymore. It's not coherent as a system. It's more coherent than its previous iterations of customs and sales and excise and stuff, but it's really not a very coherent system.
To your point about sin tax versus the other, I think another interesting thing that happened recently was about fantasy games, right?
Yes,
So game of chance is going to be taxed just like game of
yes.
skill, and that makes absolutely no sense, right? One is gambling and the other involves skill. So
Yeah.
I think we
But
are.
this has been going on for a long time. Kaun Banega Crorepati, one of the earliest cases that they were trying to figure out in when Star TV is KVC a game of chance or a game of skill? Because that determines how much tax the winner has to pay. So I think that was like a big thing they were trying to figure out. Star TV, any game show, they've been trying to figure this out for ages and make sure that they are in a different category from lotteries, which are also, by the way, huge source of tax revenue. I think even lotteries were left out of
Yeah.
GST. At least the earlier iteration was left out. So this is actually not just a fantasy, league thing. This has been going on for a while in India, which is why now the thing is there aren't too many instances where there are game shows or gambling. So you can think of those questions on a case by case basis. Barfi versus chocolate barfi versus barfi with dry fruits, dealing with that on a case by case basis is just bonkers, right? So even there, I can understand why with lottery or property, like there are certain areas where you can say, you know what, this makes sense to devote some administrative time. It's a tiny fraction of the economy. We got to figure this out. People are making very, very large amounts of money in their wins. So, and it's relatively inelastic. It's not like they'll stop playing. So, let's make sure that we really look into this. So I understand that. Uh, but applying that logic of case by case to the rest of the economy is just bananas, you know.
Yeah, I mean, that would definitely make it good simple tax if there was just one flat rate, right?
Yeah.
But
One
there may,
non-zero flat rate. You can still have a zero rate for
yeah,
necessities.
yeah, absolutely, like grocery and all of
Yeah.
that. So you recommend that having a flat rate is the best way to go, but to those people who are fans of a Robin Hood tax system where people need to be taxed at a higher
Yes.
rate when it comes to buying luxury goods like a Louis Vuitton bag or whatever, right? Um, what is the uh, what is your take on that?
I would say actually, even if you're Robin Hood, you should go for a very simple GST. And the reason is right now, a cost is being paid by people in terms of a compliance cost, rent seeking cost, deadweight losses, which is not coming to the government. If you're a Robin Hood, what do you want? You want maximum revenue for the government that the government can then redistribute back to the folks that they think truly deserve it, right? So either the poorest people, or in some cases to women, to children, to healthcare systems. So I would say, even if you're a Robin Hood, what you really want to do if you're a smart Robin Hood is maximize tax revenue. That gives you the bigger kitty to redistribute. And if you are able to get that bigger kitty, the only way to do that is either by terrorizing people into complying an incoherent system. And India, thankfully, doesn't have the state capacity to do that, right? So it can't literally terrorize people like the mafia, going collecting hafta from spot to spot. And option number two is that you actually do this by making it a very simple, clean system where it's easy for everyone to comply, remove all these crazy cesses, keep it straightforward. And the larger sum of money that comes to you, make sure you redistribute that. So, Robin Hoods, also please take note. Don't focus narrowly on consumption. Focus on increasing the revenue base, which always comes through when you increase simplicity.
Yeah, yeah. Making it simple will increase revenue in the long run. I think we should stop bothering about
Yeah.
who pays what and how much and all of that. Well, Shruti, thank you so much for
Exactly.
your time. It was so great talking to
Thank you.
you. You gave some really lovely insights about GST, what went wrong, and it was great to hear about the initiatives from Emerging Ventures. And uh, I'll link the website in the show notes so that a lot more people can benefit from it. And I think what you and your team is doing at George Mason is just fantastic. So continue doing that. And yeah, I actually love your podcast. So I just have to do that honorable mention. I'll link that as well on the show
No,
notes.
thank
So
you so much. Thank you so much. This was such a pleasure. I've been looking forward to our chat, and I love the name of your podcast and also love all the guests you've had so far. So, good luck with it. And I'm looking forward to listening to more.
absolutely. Thank you so much.